Hello, welcome back everybody, and welcome to the channel. If it's your first time here, I'm Rob, and today we are going to be painting an Alpha Legion Predator for the Horus Heresy. So I have done an Alpha Legion tutorial, I would say probably maybe 18 months to 2 years ago now, and I thought it was about time that we did it on something bigger. This will be really useful if you're looking at just painting tanks more generally, about how I would go about highlighting them. But also this is going to go through a metallic scheme as well, and how I would use speed paints through an airbrush to get a metallic finish, how I would do pre-highlighting with silver and then shading it with red and then doing the blues over the top as well. Now this is a longer video than normal. It's a tank, so it's going to take us longer to kind of go through all the details. If you haven't seen my tutorials before, I'm literally just going to walk you through exactly all the steps that I've done to be able to paint them. So we're going to start off with gunmetal. All the paints used in this tutorial today are Army Painter paints. However, I have used some oils from Winsor & Newton. A little bit of a mix match, but predominantly, in fact, all of the paints are going to be Army Painter paints. And what we're doing is laying a base down of gunmetal. This is Warpaint Fanatic, but they do obviously have an air range, and you could also use the speed paint range as well. Actually, I think the speed paint range would be quite good for this, but obviously because it's a Fanatic paint, it's an acrylic paint. Thin it with a bit of Army Painter's thinner, and it goes through the airbrush quite nicely. But what I would say is that each airbrush and each compressor is individual. I have the PSI quite high, like between 30 and 40, which is a little bit unusual. Most people probably run it about 25. So it goes through relatively straightforward. We are going to be using Shining Silver next. Now, if you've got Shining Silver or Mithril Silver, you could use either of these. But really, what you want to do is use the brightest possible silver that you have got. Now, there is quite a jump between the Gunmetal and the Shining Silver. That's okay, because we're going to soften that transition with a little bit of red speed paint. Now, in terms of highlighting a tank and how I'd go about highlighting, so all of the parts that you've seen me highlight so far, the gun, the kind of curved cover of the las cannons, not really sure what the term would be, and then these cylinders that are the exhaust, all of those are highlighted how we would expect light to bounce off of them. This turret here is being highlighted in the way that you might expect. However, with the sides that are at the 90-degree angle, we will treat them slightly differently. But because this turret is a sphere, we're highlighting it how we would expect a sphere to be highlighted. However, because there's a flat edge here, what I'm doing is I'm highlighting it in a reverse manner, and that's basically because Space Marine tanks are very blocky. They use lots of 45-degree and 90-degree angles, and we want to emphasize that. On the table, emphasizing that where there is an angle, it makes the Space Marine tank look better. I think look better. It's not realistic in any way, shape, or form. Scale modelers would avoid this kind of highlighting, but it really pushes the contrast of the model because it really pushes the angles of the model. It is down to personal preference, though, I think is what I would say. This is how I like to highlight it. This is how many people like to highlight their tanks. But if you want to do it in a way that is more kind of more typical of scale modeling, the way you think light would bounce off of it, then you do it that way. There's no right or wrong with the highlighting. It's about personal preference. So in terms of the top of the tank, you can see me here just highlighting the top of it completely. So I'm treating it like a flat panel, and the light is bouncing on the top of it, and I'm just giving it an all-over highlight. All right, I will shade it in a bit, but essentially that's just given an all-over highlight. The front of the tank, the bottom of the front of the tank is given a highlight, and then we will move on to the sides of the tank, which is going to be slightly easier to see how I kind of just would generally highlight it. So you can see these parts here that are slightly slopes. So here we go. So the back of the tank, you can see I'm highlighting the bottom, and then the sides of the tank, you can see I'm highlighting the bottom of it as well. So wherever we have a 90-degree or 45-degree angle, what we want is to have absolute light against absolute darkness. Okay, so really emphasizing the blocky nature of these Space Marine tanks. Like with an Eldar tank, we would do it differently because it's nice and curved. You know, it's got really sexy curves on it, right? Space Marine tanks, they're blocky. We want to emphasize that. Blood Red. You know, if you've seen any of my tutorials before, this is one of my go-to paints. This is a go-to paint I use for the alphalegion scheme. But it's a go-to paint that I use in lots of kind of like different recipes. Really bright, really vibrant. And what I'm doing here is I'm hiding this in the shadows. So basically where we left that gunmetal color behind, what I'm doing is reinforcing it with a different color this time. And I'm using red because it's a contrasting color to the turquoise that I'm going to be using later on. So it's really going to up the contrast on the model. I think that you can see it really clearly within this tank, but on Marines in particular, I think where we want to maximize contrast in such small areas, it works really, really well on Marines. You could use, if you didn't want to use a red, you could use a green, because of course, well, would I use a green? Mate, you want to use a warm colour, but a green would potentially work. The reason also I'm using a red here is because I like the combination of the reds combined with those teals, those blues, and it kind of makes a purpley colour within the shadows as well. It's not mixing together, they're overlapping. It's nothing to do with mixing colours, they're just overlapping, but create some cool kind of contrast and cool shading and an interesting color as well. But as you can see, I'm just hitting this in the areas where the original gunmetal has been left behind. As I say, that you can shade it with greens, I think would work. You know, you could always, you might want to go towards warmer colors, maybe oranges could work quite nicely, but I think I've had really good success with the red, so I'd probably just recommend sticking with that one. And then just going around the bottom of the tank here. This is straight through the airbrush. I haven't thinned this with any thinner, no kind of speed paint medium at all. Just straight through the airbrush. But as I say, my PSI is running quite high, around 30 to 40. So it's able just to push it through the airbrush. If you're working around a 20 PSI, you might need to thin it a little bit or up your PSI. With the man coming out the hatch, I'm just hitting the sides and the underneath parts as well, because we want a little bit of contrast on these models. I've tried to include as much footage of this as possible, because I think that when the algorithm's going to hate this really, because it's not a 12-minute video, but when you guys are painting your own tanks, you might want to use this as a reference. You might want to slow it down, you might want to rewatch it, and just kind of use it as a reference. This is how I typically shade and highlight all tanks. Like when I do the Kratos course, this is how I'd go about doing it and showing people how to do it as well. So yeah, use this as a reference. And as you can see, the top parts where the gunmetal's been left behind, you shade those areas with the red. And the closer I get to the tank, the more intense it will be. The further away, the less intense it will be, but the spray pattern will be bigger. So lots of this is about trigger control. And this is something, again, I say on the Kratos course, on lots of my courses, that sometimes it doesn't really matter how good your airbrush is, how expensive it is. You can get the same effects with a £100 airbrush to a £500 airbrush. Sometimes it's just literally about practice and muscle memory and trigger control. So it's just something to bear in mind. I'm using a custom Micron here, which is a Iwata airbrush. It's very precise, a very expensive airbrush, but yeah, I can justify the cost because my job is a commission painter. But you guys might have a less precise airbrush, but sometimes it's just about the trigger control rather than the the caliber or the expense of the airbrush. A Ferrari will get you to A to B, but so will a Reliant Robin, right? It's just that the journey is just slightly different, but the end result, getting from one place to another, is the same. Is what I like to kind of tell my students on the course. And then you can see here I've just shaded the top area just because I felt like it was a little bit too flat. I was intending to leave it flat, but I was like, ooh, maybe I need to just enhance this a little bit. Where you've gone a little bit over the top of the red, you can always go back in with that shining silver, as I'm doing here, and just hitting those places, those curved doors. If you think that they're kind of like the top of spheres that have just been cut, then the light would hit it right on the top, and then the edges around it would be in shade. So we can just go around with the shining silver and just kind of like reinforce it, particularly the mid areas where I feel like I went a little bit over the top with the red. So there's could be a little bit of going backwards and forwards with this. But what I would say is don't get too hung up on this, right? I mean, I understand it's the foundation, so it's important, but you could go backwards and forwards trying to get it perfect, and it may never be perfect. Now, I have lots of experience painting these tanks, so you know, obviously it's easy for me to say that, and it's easy for me to feel comfortable doing this, but yeah, I did have to go back in with it. Right, the magic source, Plasmatic Bolt and Highlord Blue. We're going to use 8 parts Plasmatic Bolt, 1 part Highlord Blue, and then I just pour it into the cup. If you're going to do a big army, I'd recommend mixing a big pot of this all together. I kind of count them out, and then sometimes I forget where I counted, and when I forgot, I have to get rid of it, because the blue against the green is very strong. When you use 8 parts of the green, the Plasmatic Bolt, and then 1 part Highlord Blue, and the Highlord Blue has a really dominant effect on it. So it's really important that you get the ratios right if you want a tank that looks like this. If you want something more blue, more blue alphalegion, then add more blue in. If you want something that's more green or more teal, turquoisey, then add more of the Plasmatic Bolt in. It's up to you ultimately to decide. This is, but if you want something that looks like this tank, then use this mix. And then the other thing I would say is it's really important to build this up in very, very thin coats. One of the dangers, I think, on very flat panels like this, unlike with Space Marines or smaller models, is that it can have a tendency to run if you do it too thick, and pull in places if you do it too thick. So you can dry it with a hairdryer in between, which I think is always a good idea. But another good idea is just to do it in very, very thin coats. I think it was probably about 8 coats to get to where this tank is right now on the screen. 8 thin coats, building it up over time. It will take you about half an hour to do 1 tank, maybe a little bit less, but I think I was filming in between, so it slowed down the process, but I think it was important to get this process right. So just take your time with it when you do this process. Right, back in with the shiny silver, and I'm using a very large makeup brush, very soft makeup brush for this, and I'm just catching the edges. With these kinds of metallic schemes, I think it's always important to have edges that are not picked out. It's almost like your edge highlight. This is what this is, and it's a quick way to go about doing an edge highlight, but you're edge highlighting with silver, and it's kind of showing that the paint has worn away, leaving the silver underneath, which I imagine would be for like an alphalegion scheme. We won't talk about whether it's ceramite and what color ceramite is, but I think that in order to render the shape, to pick out those edges, this part is important. Right, we're going to use Mossy Green and Matte White now. Now, the entire model is gloss varnished. And then once I've gloss varnished it, I then mask it off where you want to do your stripes, etc, etc. Totally up to you to where you want to put your stripes. If you want to put stripes down, if you want white, I always use white as my secondary color because that matches the transfers, of course. But we want a white with a little bit of shadow, and then we're going to use this kind of like this pale green grey, I think I would kind of describe it as pale green white, and I like it because it's greeny. So I often think of alphalegion being blues and purples and greens, those kind of cool colors. So choosing something with a little bit of green in it, I think was kind of like perfect as the base color. This is a Fanatic paint. It goes through the airbrush really nicely, but you do obviously have to thin it because they are quite thick. And then the other thing to say though is that you don't need to build this up too much. Two thin coats, and that will get you to where you need to be. This is pure matte white from the Air range. This is not a Fanatic version, although I do have used the Fanatic version. It's just literally the matte Air white was sitting right next to me, so I just used that. And then what I'm doing here is I'm just highlighting with white. This will take about 3 thin coats to build up. And remember, build it up in thin layers. Do a toot with your airbrush, as you can see me doing here, and then leave it, hair dry it, or just leave it and do another part, right? So it's really important in between those layers to leave it to dry. Once it's dry, once you're happy with that color, you can then peel off the masking tape very carefully. Now, everything is protected because I've used gloss varnish. Just be super careful with it though, because we don't want any of the paint to wear away. Now, what you can also do is just pick away, because the matte varnish is just protecting underneath. You can pick away with a scalpel just some of that paint. You can use some hairspray underneath it. I've done videos about using hairspray previously, but you don't necessarily need to use hairspray as long as you're careful. Everything is then gloss varnished one more time, and that protects, that locks in all of the paintwork that we've done, and it's nice and shiny at this point. It's getting to where we need it to be, and then we're going to move on to transfers. Now, with our transfers, I like to give it a gloss varnish because I like a nice smooth area to be able to do my decals on. I do understand some people don't like to use gloss varnish for this. I find that it is more successful, the process is more successful if you do it, and then you don't have that horrible line around the outside, and we don't have air bubbles stuck underneath it as well. But we are going to use Micro Sol, which is Micro Sol and Micro Set. Micro Set is number 1. It's got 1 on it, and it's the blue one. I lay that down first with a brush. I then use a takeaway container with a little bit of tissue in, some kitchen towel, put my cut up transfers on it, and then sit the transfers on top, and then take them off after a minute or so, and then they just come off really nicely rather than me fishing around in a bowl of water. I think that's a more efficient way to do it. I then leave the transfers, I don't know, like 10 minutes maybe. Usually it's by the time I've done the whole tank and I go back to the beginning and it started to dry. Perfect. And then I'm going to go in with the Micro Sol. The Micro Sol is the magic one. That's the one that we really need. And then I'm going to dip my cotton wool bud here, a Q-tip if you're an American, and I'm just going to roll it over the transfers. And then what that will help it do is adhere to the curved shapes, to the flat shapes, and just essentially melt it against that area. And we can pop any air bubbles that might crop up. I didn't have any air bubbles on this one this time around. It's always a little bit of a challenge with the massive transfers on the back. That's always an area where a little bit of trepidation, but because I used the gloss varnish, it just meant there was less likely to be air bubbles. Take your time with this. This is a really important step. This is adding our secondary color to our tank here. You can just see me rolling it very gently. I'm not doing this hard at all. This is a really gentle process, and then you can just leave it. And if you want to come back, say in half an hour's time, and do a second coat exactly the same as we've done here, you can. I always find that successful. And then you can just leave it, maybe go have some lunch, leave it for an hour or so, and then you'll be pretty much good to go. I think I actually left this one overnight, and I came back to it in the morning just because of the timings of when I started filming and when I started the tank as well. Right, back in with Shining Silver. So we obviously kind of edge highlighted / dry brushed it just to render the shape, but I just wanted to add a little bit more chipping just to show where like bullets and chips from like rocks and things like that had taken away some more of the paintwork. And you can just go in with a sponge that's been dabbed in some Shining Silver. I would always recommend with this process that you just dab off your sponge onto a dry surface and then dab it onto your tank. We don't need to go berserk with this. We don't need to go over the top with this at all. Okay, sometimes less is more. Right, we're going to use our oils now. So we're going to use Burnt Umber and Lamp Black by Winsor & Newton. You've seen me use these before if you've watched any of my videos. If you've not, I've got a whole weathering cargo 8 ridge hauler, which basically goes through how to use oils. So if you've not used them before, then maybe go check out that video now and then come back to this one. But essentially, we've got a little metal ramekin, we've got some oils, and then we've got some white spirit. This is odorless white spirit. You could use turpentine, I guess. You could use Sansador. Only thing I find about Sansador in particular, it just takes so long to dry. And who has time for that, right? It takes like 24 hours to dry. I think this took me 2 hours filming a podcast, and then by the time I got to it, it was relatively dry and ready to be cleaned up. I've matte varnished everything again after the transfers and after the battle damage. Again, I am locking in everything we've done. It's like pausing your game or sorry, saving your game, your computer game. You've kind of like locked it in, you're good to go, ready to move on to the next level. And if something goes wrong, we can always wipe it away because we've lost it. What you can see me doing with the oils that are around the consistency of milk, maybe a little bit thicker than that though, I'm going around and pin washing it. I'm not slathering my oils all over the tank because that will affect the underlying color. I just want to pin wash the entire model, all the rivets, etc. And then we then use the satin varnish. Now, I use satin for these tanks because I have used a metallic base coat underneath and then use speed paint, and I want the idea it is a metallic finish to the paint work. If you're going to use a matte varnish, I would question why you would use a metal underneath it, is all I would say. You could finish it in gloss, but I think it'd be quite shiny, so I think satin is a good one to do. And then now that it's satin, now we've got rid of the gloss, it's going to be easier to do all the other details, particularly the metallics. It's always going to be difficult painting metallics over a glossed varnish surface because it's not going to adhere, it's not going to bind as well. So having it satin means we can start doing all the other details, and we're going to go back in that with that gunmetal. We're using actually a relatively limited amount of paints today. Once we've done the gunmetal, we're going to go in dark tone. It's essentially just a black wash. I've used lots of other washes on the channel before, but this one, let's just keep it simple because we're going to use some rust effects a little bit later. So yeah, that will make the metallics more interesting. So this bit is just relatively straightforward. It's relatively boring. You could use soft tone if you really, really want, but I think just the black works fine, right? Like, let's just keep the palette relatively simple and not too complicated. And then we're going to go back in with that shining silver, and then we're going to do some dry brushing. If there's any other edges that you've missed and wanted to dry brush, then you can do that. You'll notice that the tracks have been done in between. That was a mixture of Brigadine Brown and matte black, and just base coated all the tracks and the wheels as well. We will keep them black, or this dark brown color. Tracks tend to be in real life not metal. They tend to be like a rubberized metal with like the metal kind of like peeking through, and that's what we're going to try and create here. And then we're going to use some rust effects after all the metallics have been dry brushed. So we're going to use dark rust, and I think it's fresh rust. We're going to use a 50-50 mix. One was too light, one was too dark, so I wanted somewhere in the middle, and then we're going to mix it with lots of airbrush thinner. This is the kind of like mixture I would use for verdigris, patina. You know, dump a whole load of airbrush thinner in, and then what you want this to do is just to seep into all the gaps and all around the rivets. It's got to be able to move over that area. You'll see how thin this is in a second. And then what I like to do, because my alphalegion are on kind of Martian red oxide bases, I like to use quite a lot of rust here on all my metallics. You can use this on rivets. I think sometimes just picking out a few rivets here and there where rust has started to accumulate, or where dust has started to accumulate, is absolutely great. But again, I think less is more. Like, absolutely do it on the metallic areas. No problem there, but you can see me doing it on the blue areas here. Just less is more. You don't need too much of this. Don't go berserk with it. Don't go too over the top with it. You know, just areas where you think rusting might occur. Of course, it's up to you, but sometimes I just think less is more. Right, we're going to go into hardened leather now. This is blood red hardened leather. These are always colors that I come back to, and I've mixed hardened leather with a pinch of gloss varnish, just the tiniest amount of gloss varnish, and then I'm using this over all the wires and anything that I want to be copper. Now, you know how I love verdigris. I'm not going to use any verdigris here on this because I've used like rust, so that's kind of enough for the weathering, I think, if we've got kind of like rust effects. But I tend to use copper for anything that can conduct electricity or energy. Anything that's a conductor, use copper on. I think that looks really nice. Try and use 3 different metallics on your tanks, just to add a little bit of interest. And you know, these last cannon like wires, this is a really easy way to do it. And then this is it, like this is the copper. Because it's a speed paint, it goes into all the nooks and crannies. It works in the way that you'd expect a speed paint to do, but because we've had a little tiny bit of gloss varnish in, it doesn't mat it down too much and still makes it look metallic. Death Metal, Greedy Gold, 50-50 mix. This, I had not mixed these two colours together, and I was like, I wonder if this can make a bit of a desaturated gold. And it did, and it looked really good. I was really pleased with this colour, and this is definitely a colour I will have to come back to in the future. This kind of like mix, this desaturated gold base coat. I was like, oh yeah, this is the goat. This is the one. And if the army painter are watching, you guys need to make a new paint with these two like mixed together, and you can just sell that as paint, and it can be called Medas Gold or something like that. I don't know, but it's a really nice kind of like base coat. You can add more of the Greedy Gold if you want it to be lighter, of course, or you can use more of the other color if you want it to be slightly darker, slightly more desaturated. Completely up to you. Then we go in with pure Greedy Gold, and we just give it a rough highlight. Nothing more complicated than that. But just give it kind of just a general rough highlight. Doesn't need anything more. And then we're going to go in some soft tone. Now this is pure soft tone. Didn't add any gloss varnish in or anything like that. When you look at the artwork for the alphalegion, they often have like a gold kind of front plate, or some parts that are gold or a brass color. So just having this breaks up some of the silver and the blue, just having a few areas, but I don't think you want to overwhelm it with too much gold, which is why it's good to just to have a little bit of coppers in there as well, because I don't think of alphalegion particularly being a gold legion, but it just breaks it up, just a pop of color. And yeah, this lovely color, this lovely wash can just kind of go into the nooks and crannies. It was soft tone. Back in with Hardened Leather. I'm going to use this through the airbrush now, and we're going to use this on the top of the exhaust, but you can also hit any kind of like vents on the actual tank itself with this color. Just build this up slowly, and I would say each of these has probably been hit with 2 to 3 thin coats of this color. I like to leave like the bottom third metal, and then the top third hit with this, the top 2/3 hit with this color, but particularly a focus at the end. And then we're going to go in Slaughter Red, exactly the same, straight through the airbrush. So we're actually using an awful lot of speed paints on this tank. I know it doesn't look like we're using, you see the end product and go, oh, I don't think he's used that many speed paints, but an awful lot on this. Because they're translucent, you can see some of that underlying shine and some of that underlying color. That's why I'm using them. And we hit the last cannons with that. And then Hive Dweller Purple. And we're going to hit the very tippity end of the las cannons with this. So for all my kind of like energy weapons and my melter weapons, I use this on my alphalegion. I'm not saying that you guys have to, it's up to you, but it's just that that's the theme through my army. Again, those blues and those purples and those whites, those are kind of like the colors that I like to go for, those greens and those whites. Just keep it homogenized across the army, I think, is critical. And then at the tippity top of your exhaust, I like to also use this color as well, and it doesn't look purple at all. It kind of looks like a smoky black effect with the brown and the purple overlapping each other, and it looks really, really nice. So you're not using too many colors, you're not having to buy too many colors, because you can kind of like reuse them, but it gives a completely different effect when we use kind of different overlapping colors in the end. And then we're going to go to, now this is, do this if you're brave, dried brown and molten lava, 1 part dried brown and 1 part molten lava. Now we could do this with weathering powders. What I find though with gaming pieces is that sometimes it can just come off when you're gaming with them, and I am predominantly a gamer, so it's important for me to be able to pick up these models and put them on the table, etc. And what I'm just doing is I'm dusting the bottom of this tank with this orange brown mix, and that's going to match all my basing. Now I did go in with just a little bit of orange, molten orange at the end, just to brighten it up a little bit, just to match the bases. However, it's completely up to you. This actually just makes like a good earthy color, just in general. I think that this will just suit most bases. But yeah, this just allows me to create like dust along the bottom of the tank, but also I can pick it up and feel quite comfortable that nothing's going to come off on my fingers. Nothing's going to be rubbed off like it would with weathering powders. And then this is the tank. Now, I have just painted the lenses, reds and oranges and yellows, nothing too fancy. You know, paint whatever lens color you want. And then I've done the head. I've done you know, some kind of face tutorials previously, but sometimes it's a little bit harder, a little bit trickier with a camera in between. And then this is the finished product. I've used a little bit of like thinned with water weathering powder in just some of the nooks and crannies, not on the actual kind of like bottom of the tank, but just collected. You can see areas along the bottom of the tank where it's just collected up. And I've done kind of like weathering videos, or sorry, weathering powder videos. My last video was a weathering kind of like basing video, and you can kind of use those products if you want to, or just a bit of weathering powders mixed with water. But this is the finished tank. This is what it would look like in the end. Now, what I always say with these videos is, I think for me, this is less a review. And these videos are always about giving you guys tutorials, and straightforward tutorials, how I would go about painting these tanks, how I'd go about painting these models, and then hopefully you can take these ideas, you can substitute different colors if you wanted to, and you can kind of, it's up to you to play around with these things. But hopefully this is giving you a good idea how I would paint an alphalegion tank, but also how I would paint any other kind of metallic tank as well. So word bearers, typically, in my head at least, I'd often think of them as a metallic scheme. Night Lords you can do in metallic as well, and this is how I would go about kind of shading them. So with a metallic Night Lord scheme, what you could do is you do your pre-highlight of dark silver and light silver, and then you maybe do purple in the shadows where we did the red before, and then you do the blue over the top. And that's not about contrasting color there, that's just about adding depth to the blues and adding that kind of like purple blue into it, so it kind of it looks like in Midnight Clad, right? But with word bearers in that scenario, because I'm putting red over the top, what I might do is put green into the shadows or blue into the shadows where we put the red before. So I'm just constantly thinking about what colors like work together, what colors overlapping, what kind of depth of color that would give as well. But so don't just see this as an alphalegion tutorial, guys. See this as a how would I paint a metallic tank tutorial, and then hopefully there's some good kind of like weathering tips along the way as well. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope it's been useful. If you have got this far right to the end, then make sure, if you haven't already, give me a subscribe, give me a like, and don't forget to comment. Just let me know. What would be really good, actually, is if you guys let me know kind of what other videos you want to see. I've got in my head at the moment, I've got some 40k stuff kind of coming. I've got some Sanguinary Guard, some Atlantean Spears that I'd like to do, with a particular focus on 40k and Space Marines leading into the Christmas period. But if there is something that you guys are desperate for me to do, I definitely think we can sort that out. So just pop it in the comments below, just give me some ideas. Anyway, guys, thanks for taking the time to watch. I hope you enjoyed it. I really appreciate it, you guys watching it, and I'll see you on the next one.